Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I am Kate Charlet. I want to welcome you to the Carnegie Endowment for a great event today. I want to also welcome the folks who are joining us online over live stream. I am really thrilled to have two people here today, people who are at the heart of what our government is doing in cybersecurity and cyber policy. And I think we're going to have a really unique cross-agency conversation. In my experience, it's not often that you have DOD and DHS here together to talk about how what they're doing integrates and how they work together. So we have Assistant Secretary Jeanette Manfra from the Department of Homeland Security and Deputy Assistant Secretary Ed Wilson from the Department of Defense. You've got their more detailed, extensive biographies, very impressive ones. But suffice to say, they're really at the heart, of what their agencies are doing in cyber policy, whether that's covering issues across nation-state threats to reconceptualizing our approach to how we protect our country from cyber threats, and instrumental as well in some of the strategies that we've seen coming out over the last several months, a DHS strategy, a DOD strategy, and a White House U.S. strategy for cyber policy. Given the challenges that we're facing in cyberspace, it's so critical for DOD and DHS to be working together to have really integrated strategies, and that need is obvious. But it's not always so clear from the outside how and whether that's really happening. Sometimes it sounds like DHS and DOD are kind of competing for space, or sometimes it sounds like DOD with its kind of, one component of what you do is an offensive mission, and how does that tension work between the defensive and kind of protection mission that DHS has. So today I'm hoping we can kind of talk through some of these impressions, debunk some of the myths, and or reaffirm them, but hopefully debunk some of them, and hear how your strategies integrate, how you're working together, and maybe even get specific with some use cases to help everybody get really concrete about where those interconnectivities lie. So I think let me start with Ed to talk a little bit about DOD's new cyber strategy, because that's still pretty fresh on everybody's minds. The strategy does a lot of things that are new, including the military taking a more active role in cyberspace. But I was hoping you could back us up a little bit, talk a little bit about kind of the origin story. What were some of the big strategic choices that you had to make in the course of developing the strategy? What is the most different or new in your perspective, and why you chose this direction?
Well, first, Kate, let me say thank you to you and really to the Carnegie Endowment for bringing this event together. So just hats off to you. Like you said, it's not often. Sometimes we're on stage, but not always together. And so that happened earlier today, for instance. We were both at a similar event, but on different times. So this really is a unique opportunity. So thank you. So when the DOD, we recognized that we needed to update the strategy, and there was a couple of reasons why. I think we can all point to the strategic environment, and the threats and the landscape of the current threat environment we see today is very different than when we published our first DOD strategy cyber strategy back in 2011, and again in 2015. Some of the threats, especially when it comes to the homeland, and the recognition that the homeland is really not a sanctuary like it used to be in many regards, but especially with regards to cyber threats. And so the framework that we had to think through on how does the DOD bring its unique capabilities forward in this context. The other piece was we have a new unified command in the form of Cyber Command, and if you were to look at the 2015 cyber strategy, DOD cyber strategy, you would see us very focused on building capacity and trying to normalize operations. Whereas now that we have a fully elevated unified command in the form of U.S. Cyber Command, and we have a cyber mission force that is now up in terms of completing the build, we can have pivoted to be a bit more, as you say, proactive in nature. And so we wanted to signal that shift in the strategy, both internally but also externally. And so partnerships with DHS and the other departments and agencies as it related to Homeland Security and Defense, and getting clear lines of authorities there, and how we would support DHS in its capacities, but also put in place the mechanism so that we could bring the capabilities and the authorities forward that we've been given. And so really it's just like we do in any other domain. It's how do we compete, really deter, and then if called upon, win in any type of conflict through the full spectrum of conflict in cyberspace, just like we do in every other domain of operations. But given the current threat environment, it was incumbent that we update that. In addition, the National Defense Strategy, which really focuses on lethality, partnerships and allies, and then as well as reform in the department. That signaled a very significant shift with regards to rogue actors and day-to-day competition. And what we've seen in cyberspace across the missions is nation states that are seeking to gain strategic advantage by operating below thresholds of response, or traditional thresholds of response. And so we tried to come at the problem and begin to look at new approaches that would be able to allow us to compete in that framework without trying to bring hostilities into cyberspace, but really to reinforce the norms of behavior on the international front. And so that was really the backdrop of why now. We get that question quite often. And it really paired well with DHS's cybersecurity strategy that's on the street, and then with the new national cyber strategy. If you can't see the themes that roll between the top tier of the nation strategy and our DOD strategy, then we missed the mark. But I think you can see the echoes very strongly.
Well, maybe can you draw out one kind of aspect of that strategy, which is the defend forward component, which I think has been getting a lot of discussion. What is that? I see it as DOD's mission is looking outside of our borders. And so the role is to disrupt malicious cyber activity from closer to the source. But can you talk a little bit more about that concept and how it plays in the strategy? And then I'll be interested to get Jeanette's kind of reaction on how DOD's strategy and some of these concepts mesh in with DHS's.
We looked at the uniqueness of what the Department of Defense brings to this mission space across the U.S. government. And clearly the Department of Defense is focused externally on external threats to the nation. And so when you read our strategy, what you'll see is an external focus, outward facing, that is threat-centric. And so we look at the threats, try to understand the threats, and we typically have a unique perspective in the Department of Defense, along with the intelligence community and other departments and agencies, but we do bring a unique perspective to it. And so as we operate in red space, so to speak, that external framework, to be prepared, we're going to see and understand threats and maybe in a unique way. And so as we do that, and as we brought the cyber mission force up to bear, if you will, and a heightened sense of readiness, is we wanted to make sure that we were pivoting and bringing information forward to share across interagency lines, but also the defend forward construct is we want to see those threats forming to the best of our ability, and if we have the opportunity and we have the choice now to make a decision on whether to disrupt or maybe deter along with the other instruments of power for the nation, not just cyber effects operations, but to bring those to bear alongside other instruments of power from the nation, as well as with our allies and partners. And so that was really the construct that we thought through for Defend Forward. And it's the uniqueness of the Department of Defense. That's what the department does, is worry about national security threats. Those tend to be externally focused, but what we're seeing is, as I hinted at, the homeland is not a sanctuary like it is in many regards in the other domains of operation. But in this, it's very unique in that we think we can offer some information, intelligence, et cetera, that we can share across interagency lines, as well as if there's a significant incident in the nation that outstrips maybe other organizations' capabilities and capacity that we can bring to bear, and we've thought through how to do this, is to bring to bear in concert and work with DHS and other departments and agencies to be able to respond to a significant event. We knew that that was one of the roles the Department of Defense was going to be asked to step up to. Now we've put concrete.
So Jeanette, how does this balance, integrate, reinforce how you're thinking about the world?
So I think what you heard Ed talking about in terms of looking at external threat actors that in some way want to take activity that we want to deter, And we see ourselves as very much, the risk-based approach, and threat being a component of that, but also having an understanding of vulnerability and consequence. And a lot of the conversations, both on the policy and the operations side, in the past, have been a lot about, what's my clearly defined role, what's your clearly defined role, and how do we hand that off very clearly so it's very obvious who's in charge when. And it just doesn't work that way. And that's, I think, a really important realization is there is not perfect clarity that you're going to achieve, and we're comfortable in operating with some need for flexibility between that, because as Ed mentioned, my theory is, because we've achieved strategic dominance in so many other areas, is why we have adversaries who are finding ways to hold us at risk in the homeland. And we talk a lot about the concepts of collective defense and understanding the risk to our country, and people sort of working together with DHS and private sector and state and locals. But we also have to have DOD in that, is that if we've got adversaries who are seeking to hold us at risk in the homeland, there's a lot that we can do to protect ourselves better, to prevent those things from happening, but we also need to be postured to have some both strategic and sort of tactical deterrence where those actions are coming from. And it works better if we're working very closely together. And so we try to think of it less about, let's define my clear roles and responsibilities, and where we'll have this very clear handoff from, my organization in one side of Arlington to his organization in another side of Arlington, and more about, we understand what our authorities are. They are complementary. They're not overlapping, but they're complementary. So that means if we're working together, then we kind of combine our forces in the shape of a water bucket, and that's an old cartoon reference for any of you in the 80s. And we can be that much stronger. It's sort of the same. It's the same conversation that we're having with critical infrastructure in the homeland. Is we all manage risks to the homeland. We think at DHS our unique differentiator is that we can sit and have a picture of what that actual risk actually is. We can characterize that risk through whether those are information sharing, or we have people sharing the functions that they may be performing, or the intelligence that we're getting, and we can pull all those together, and we can have a sense of what the risk to the nation is. And then we have these unique authorities where we can bring everybody together and say, okay, now what are we going to do about it? It's not all the government to manage that risk. We have to do that together. But that's sort of where we see the two of us working together. And the better DOD is at their job, the better my job is. And I think vice versa, the better I am at my job, the more prepared and capable DOD is. And so what sometimes people may see where you said, there's tension, I think that's creative tension. I think it's productive, and, working through, these are really hard policy issues of, what do we want the presence of our military to be? What do we want to be in cyberspace, internationally and domestically? We've had a long policy for a couple of decades now of having a civilian, non-intelligence, non-law enforcement agency, which is my agency, responsible for the sort of bringing everybody together to defend our homeland. But that doesn't mean that we're the only ones that can do it. So our strategy, which has been out a little bit longer, largely because we had been asked for it for quite some time, but it's also the first strategy. It's our first cybersecurity strategy. It actually wasn't an update. It takes very much that approach. It's how do we understand risk to our country, and that's the first sort of pillar, is identifying risk. And the Secretary stood up the National Risk Management Center to focus on this. Our first order of business is identifying and articulating what we call national critical functions. So what are those critical functions that people in our country depend upon, whether that's the ability to process high-value transactions in the banking sector, or the ability to have energy or communications. And so working through those with industry so that we take a functions-based approach, and then working with those elements of government and industry to understand what are the different tools we have to know who might be seeking to disrupt or deny those functions, and either, whether that's this largely a nation state sort of capability right now. So who's seeking to disrupt those? How might they do that? And then what protections can we put in place to address that? Ed also mentioned the sort of the response side of things is that we know that we will not be able to prevent everything. So how do we get ourselves in a position where we can manage consequences before they become very significant? And that means all, alerts and warnings, better systems of how do we alert and warn each other, both within the government to industry amongst themselves. It also means rethinking our emergency management doctrine. And we have an emergency management doctrine that, whether you're somebody in DC or you're all the way down at the local level, all incidents are local. You have an understanding of what the incident command structure is. You know what the Stafford Act is. You know when to call the National Guard. These are systems that we've exercised both in real life and in exercises multiple times. And they work fairly well. But the cyber challenge sort of adds some wrinkles into that. Most of the significant incidents we think about actually may start global, not local. And they may quickly overwhelm the resources of somebody who may be trying to respond to it. If you've got a public health or safety consequence that you're trying to manage, who's managing the cyber aspect of it? And so we have to work those things out. And we have to work those out and have them in fairly detailed plans relatively quickly. Not that we're expecting any of these bad things to happen, but I think our job is always to expect the worst and plan for those. We started with the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. It's a public document if anybody's interested in reading it and sort of laying out at a high level some of these concepts. But we really need to get into those specifics and have these questions answered. When is the National Guard going to come in and assist, and what are they going to do? What is the role of DHS, and when can you expect the federal government to come in and help? Because we're not going to be able to help for every single incident, nor do I think that's our job. And so how do we have this doctrine understood, promulgated? How do we have the training in place, and how do we have, if there are any legal or policy barriers to achieving what we want to do on the response side, how do we resolve those before we actually get into significant incidents? So that's sort of where we're coming from. We're already working some of the stuff that we've talked about in the elections. We have a deeper partnership than we've ever had before in thinking about how we manage risk to our elections. We're thinking about the energy sector and how do we work together to help the energy sector, and how does the energy sector help us. And so we already have multiple examples now where we're working through some of these key issues.
Can we dig into one of those? So elections, for example, what have you asked of DOD? What has DOD, what kind of capabilities do they have to support you?
So most of what we're focused on is preparing that if we do have a situation, and to be very clear, there is no intelligence or anything that would suggest that we would be in this situation, but we wanted to have all of the various different bureaucratic and legal agreements pre-negotiated, settled. We wanted to have a very clear understanding on if we did need to call on DOD resources to supplement DHS or others, that we would have those plans in place before we actually needed them, and we've accomplished that. And then working through, we have different ways of looking at things. We have different ways of, different trade crafts, different ways of our mission. And so bringing DOD personnel into our mission space so that they can sort of get a sense of how we see things and how we think about working with partners and managing risk to the homeland. And we thought because we've been so focused on elections again, not that the intelligence is indicating that we would need it, but we thought it made a lot of sense to just leverage every resource that's available to the government and to prep ourselves in advance of that happening. And so that's what we've done.
Ed, how's that playing out in DOD? I mean, is this breaking new ground in terms of the processes you have to learn and work through or exercise?
I believe so. I think across the interagency, but principally with DHS, we really have been breaking some new ground. And I would point to information sharing that we've done in the past, but not with as much focus, I believe. Bring the DOD in, and we're going to be threat-based, and so we're going to look at the threats that may be presenting election security, the infrastructure, malign influence. So that was really where we started, is let's look at the intelligence that's being collected so that we can understand the threat, understand what consequences may be forming. And so that's why it's been helpful to be able to say with some degree of confidence, relatively high degree of confidence. So the Department of Defense, we're not trying to do DHS's job, let's be clear, but we want to make sure we support them, and we don't want to wait for a significant event and then looking at each other because we didn't share information, and now we're looking at an incident of significant consequence, or that that we're wondering why this didn't happen. And so we approach the problem that way. In the Department of Defense, one of the things, the culture that we have, is to look at a bad day for the nation and plan and build in contingencies on how we would handle that. And so as we began to look at if there was a significant incident for elections in particular, and we needed to respond, DHS respond with FBI and the resources we have, what would happen if that incident was greater than the ability to respond quickly if required? When we looked at the problem, the natural step would be to look both at industry but also the Department of Defense to maybe bring some assets forward. We operate a fairly large scope and scale to be able to bring the talent forward. And so instead of calling it up kind of an audible at the line at the last minute, is let's think through the problem and put in place the mechanism. Let's tabletop and understand how that would happen. What does the formation look like? In other words, I'll speak my DOD language. What's the concept of operations look like?
And what are those assets too? I mean, what are the assets that DOD would bring to bear?
And so using our normal process, we wanted to normalize it. We used our what we call DISCA, the Defense Support to Civil Authorities process, to pre-approve the response options that DHS felt they may need. And so we looked at the problem, but if it's of significant, then we would bring and almost double the size of the responses that could be put on deck. And to be clear, one of the things we did was to work under DHS authorities, under DHS leadership, so no DOD teams out on their own, but to partner so that we could have more capacity to address more problems if called upon. The best case will be we've gone through all this preparation and there's no issues. That's the best case. We're used to doing that in the Department of Defense. That's fine. But we don't want to be caught flat-footed if called upon. And so that's the Secretary Mattis was very clear that said, listen, we need to make sure we're successful as we move forward. So we started with information sharing. That seemed to be the most lucrative in terms of any intelligence, the information that we may have is making that available at through the right processes, classifications and all of that, but to make sure that we weren't holding anything back and that we were much more proactive in sharing. And not that that didn't go on, but with a focus and a purpose.
So this is, in a way, kind of a model of a contingency plan, being prepared for a specific date and event. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the financial sector for one that's a little bit more kind of long-term area of cooperation and the ways that might be a little bit different than like a DISCA preparation, but more of a day-to-day cooperation.
Yeah, I think, and we have actually, worked this in other sectors, although so far we have not had to actually take advantage of the DoD assets, but it's always now, it's a part of our kind of planning early when we start to see an incident start to unfold. We've got all the lawyers, they know each other's phone numbers, they know what these forms look like, and so it's sort of now a part of our own kind of concept of operations of how does this fill in if we need them. But then there's also the which is financial sector, energy sector, others. that is it's less about, you know, surge support, and it's more about we both have a role in sort of defending our country. We're focused domestically, DOD overseas, and you know, one of the things that we've talked about a lot in the financial sector really just deserves a lot of credit, although electricity, communications, IT, a few others have done this as well, is back to this critical functions piece. Is for many years we would have these conversations with industry that were a bit circular, and you know, they would say, DHS, I need your information's not relevant, timely. I want it to be more timely. I want it to be more relevant. And I would say, okay, well, what would help you to make it more relevant and timely? And say, well, you know, it would either go way down into the weeds on something that's very unique to that organization, or it would just be sort of another level of, well, you know, I just, can you just get me some more stuff from NSA? And I'm like, well, I am giving you stuff from NSA. And so it's what we finally realized kind of collectively between us and industry is that we inside the government were collecting based off of threat and adversaries and what they were doing. And we were doing our best to turn that around into things that we thought would be useful for others to incorporate into their risk processes and take action on. And sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. And what we really realized is we needed a greater understanding of how our domestic systems actually worked, the businesses, the functions of those systems, because it does sound a bit simplistic, and this isn't to say that people in government didn't understand this, but we didn't have that as sort of the driving sort of framework for how we thought about what the government was doing to provide information to help the defenders in the private sector, state and local, and frankly even other agencies. And so we really had this focus on let's everybody take a step back, and let's understand what the critical functions are for your industry, and who are the stakeholders that are involved in developing those and deploying those and sustaining those. And that creates a very different picture than our 16 critical infrastructure industry verticals, which is, you know, that is an important organizing construct. But what you start to see is, you know, managed service providers that have a niche for providing services to the financial sector. You have, you know, I think you just have a much better layered approach to thinking about how the systems in our country actually operate with the people who actually provide those or have some role in assuring their provision. And you can believe that's the way our adversaries are looking at it too. They're not just saying, gee, I wish I could just get in JP Morgan. I guess I can't, I'm done. They're going to look for a lot of different ways to try to manipulate those functions. Criminals obviously have a little bit different interest. They're trying to monetize information or other things. But you know, when we're talking about what our perspective is trying to keep our country safe and our citizens safe and systems functioning, it's really where you've got an adversary that's going to spend a lot of time trying to understand how those systems work. And so that's what the financial sector created an organization called the FSARC, Financial Systemic Analysis Risk Center. Okay. And I say FSARC so much. And it was specifically to focus on this, and a bunch of bank CEOs got together and they said, we need to invest in this both for our own for the financial stability, our responsibility, but then we need to partner with government. And so I co-chair an Indicators and Warnings committee with them, and working through, and again, it's not just me, it's bringing to bear all of the government. So it starts to say, okay, well, if we're going to invest in the government to collect information, we're doing it for operational purposes, right? We're not just doing it because it's interesting. And so it's got to be based off of this understanding. And that's what we're doing with the financial sector, is taking that picture of here's what they've identified as sort of key functions and risks to their industry. And then we bring DOD, the intelligence community, others to kind of, and we're piloting a couple of, let's actually take a couple of areas and share some indicators back and forth, see if that can enrich what we understand in the government side, see if that enrichment we do inside the government can turn around into something that's even more useful for them. I would say early signs are pointing to yes. And so it's not easy, it's not transactional. It's not, I produce a feed, you consume that feed, and I beg you for feedback every time I see you. It's much more of a collaborative understanding and process that I think is going to bear a lot of fruit. And every sector is a little bit different. So there's slightly different models that you have to use with each of them. But I really think kind of coming at it from a top down, what's the business, what's the mission, what do we care about as a country, and then how do we derive those indicators and warnings, and how do we work collaboratively to continually enrich our understanding. And then again, kind of taking it back to Ed, is how do we get ourselves in a position where we can we have both a deterrence by denial, and also deterrence through other actions, whether those are cyber or not.
And do you see that DOD role in a collaboration like what you're talking about with FSARC? Are we just starting to scratch the surface of that, or is it, what's the trajectory, I think, of the DOD involvement?
So we've been really in the second cycle of combined analytics together, so identifying threat indicators that we would want to share. And I would just harken back, I think Jeanette did a nice job of, we want to understand the threat, we want to understand the consequences that may come of it from those threats, but also the risk profile. And so what can we do about it? And then how can we bring the weight of the government in a combined sense to bear against the really tough problems? Because at times, industry will have the better game out there. Other times, the U.S. government may have, and we may be able to work through our allies and partners as well, industry as well, at large, to be able to bring to bear the right sets of capabilities. And so I think in the first couple of instantiations on the Pathfinder that we're running in the financial sector, early feedback, preliminary feedback is very positive. So much so that everybody's committed to the next round of Pathfinder. And so we're looking now, we wanted to do some very simple combined analytics, information sharing, and then look at how we could scale certain solutions. Because if we're just running very serial Pathfinders, that won't help. We need to think through the problem, understand the problem, and then see how we can scale using the weight of the government to bear.
Jeanette, you're living and breathing this mission of protection and resilience for critical infrastructure. So looping it back to the beginning, when we're talking about a more proactive DOD posture, how do you think about that? Do you worry about the blowback of that? How do you think about preparing for a more active DOD and the consequences of that for U.S. critical infrastructure?
Well, I think we've thought about this a lot. I'm not shy in the interagency process. I think we've had a lot of hard conversations, but they were necessary conversations. One of the things that I think has frustrated me in the past is an unwillingness to really dive into some of these hard things, and I think others may have been previously frustrated by this as well. And as the government, I think, has really matured around this space, it's allowed us to be able to say well, let's actually game this out. What could actually happen? I was on a panel with Rob Joyce last week or earlier this week. Sort of October is Cyber Awareness Month, so a lot of panels. We talked about this notion that somehow it's like DOD, Wild Wild West is just not true. And I'll let Ed speak to that more.
I'm hearkened to hear that.
Specifically. We did have those exact conversations, is how do we make sure that we are, as a government, having that risk-benefit conversation? And, I don't always want to be afraid to do something because we're afraid of what X consequence might be. I want to be able to articulate what those consequences are, and then I want us to have a conversation and say, is this the right thing for the government to do? Do we agree? And I believe that we've built the tools to do that, and I believe we've removed some of the bureaucracy in sort of allow us to have that in the appropriate space. And what I tell industry all the time is if there's concerns about things like blowback or unintended consequences, that just calls for what we've just been talking about, is the more insight that we can have into how our systems are connected, how they work, where the dependencies are, the better we'll be able to make smarter decisions. But we do also, we have to be able to, well, I'm a former Army officer, so I hate to say this a little bit. We do have to be able to take the fight to the enemy a little bit, and so that's I'm not saying that we got to go off and sort of start wars anywhere. Nobody's trying to do that, but it can't be sort of exclusively focused on just all the work that we're doing in the homeland. We do have to have a complementary. It just has to be very. It's easy to have consequences that we may not have understood, and so we have to have a very well-scoped and very well-coordinated conversation. And it's not the only tool that we have in the toolbox. There are other tools that the U.S. government has. Just because it's a cyber problem doesn't mean it needs a cyber solution.
So I'll turn it to Ed to the. But with one question with the new kind of the new authorities that Ed's operating under for cyber operations, do you feel like you have the right amount of say into and insight into what's going on to identify some of those areas and considerations?
I believe I do. I believe that I've had much more cooperation and collaboration with DOD in the past few months on some of these things than we've ever had before.
I would echo that. I think we've very proactively tried to be good partners across the interagency. I think when you look at the new directive that's out, just so for those that may or may not be familiar, we've recently have rescinded what was described as PPD 20, Presidential Policy Directive 20, which laid out the authorities and the process for execution of cyber effects operations, whether that's defensive or offensive. And so in its place, we've issued, the administration has issued a new directive. And why do the directive? I think Jeanette really hinted at it, is we were struggling to make decisions as whether to use cyber effects operations in concert with the other instruments of power. And so we were a bit in a lot of inaction. And so the new policy really strives to make timely decisions from the US government across interagency channels in a very transparent fashion with regard to assessment of risk and understanding the risk levels if we were to execute an operation. And so the new policy, I think, has been successful. It's only been in place for a little over 2 months now, and we are conducting operations in concert with it. I think that's a great sign of success. The feedback so far from all of the interagency partners have been very positive, and so that's a good sign. Secretary Matt's been very, very clear that he wants to ensure that we're being transparent with the interagency, so that the DOD is not capable of assessing all risk, especially when it comes to blowback risk potentially across critical infrastructure or anything. Not that we're out pursuing those types of operations, but it is the Department of Defense's job. We have a unique role to be prepared if called upon. And so the new authorities really try to strike the balance and put in place the deterrent structures to really deter behavior, malign behavior, in the norms of behavior in cyberspace, the accepted ones that are out there from the United Nations. And so as a result of that, there do need to be consequences at time. And so that's what we've tried to balance and put in place with the new directive. And so far, so good. I think we're moving along well. There's been a very good partnership across the interagency, and that's really one of the key components here, is clear communication of expectations, of risk, so that we can make timely decisions as a whole of government, not just in cyber effects operations, but across the whole of government and all the instruments of power, and that it's in a synchronized manner. And so that's what we're beginning to see, is that we bring to bear the weight of the nation when required.
Thanks for the great conversation. I think I want to open it up to questions now. So just a reminder, when I call on you, wait for the mic. Please introduce yourself and your name and organization, and focus on questions, not statements. So let's see, we will start over here with Jan.
Hi, I'm Jan Taylor from the British Embassy here in DC. So you both talked a bit about how you're working better together now. And I think kind of cross-government integration is a problem a lot of countries would recognize. Is there a single factor or change you can pinpoint in what kind of made the biggest difference in terms of working better together? And what do you think the biggest challenges you still need to overcome in your partnership are?
For me, I think it's actually getting to specifics, specific cases, and not try to solve all of these complicated policy issues in the abstract. Some of them aren't even that complicated once you actually get down to business of trying to figure out, and having a bit of an open mind, but at the same time, being very clear about, we want to be very clear about authorities and what's appropriate, and ensuring that there's sort of no crossover, because the policy still remains around having this sort of civilian focus. But to me, that's been the biggest thing, is let's stop talking at a high level about very kind of abstract concepts. Let's take a few key issues where we know we want to work together on, and let's just work through it. And be open to adjustments. The first plan is never the one that is the final one, and then getting the actual operators and analysts together, and really starting to have conversations at that level, because they're going to identify a lot of things that are both good and bad that you may not get by just sort of sitting in high level meetings.
Yeah, and I would just complement that. I think by starting small, and a willingness to work together across all of the organizations and involving multiple, the right people in the room working together with sleeves rolled up, a lot of times we can dispel some of the myths that are out there associated with these big thoughts sometimes on the policy front. And if we can just start small, we have the capability, one, to try it as a pathfinder with the understanding we're working through any challenges we may have, and then to think through it, bring back the lessons, the best practices, cycle it, which is what you see us doing on the financial sector, to try to maybe scale it one notch, understand that the techniques that we're using scale, and then we have a decision to make on the back end of that. Do we want to go bigger? And so I think it's a confidence building is really what we're doing, is by starting small on very pragmatic problems that sometimes we let the policy framework at times get in the way. And so it builds confidence, builds trust, and then we can get moving, get some momentum behind us, and then bring those solutions to bear. And then we've got some big decisions to make at times as to, do we want to scale these solutions, or do we need to totally rethink? Because it's okay when we start early like this, if we're starting small, is we're trying, because some of these things are new. Some techniques we're using are very new and innovative. It's okay to try a pathfinder and say, this isn't, let's stop this, let's try it, we've got to come at this a different way. That's okay. I mean, and I think a willingness to accept a very, very small level of risk early on, and with the understanding that you're addressing something that maybe hasn't been done before, that's okay. And so that's when we build confidence together as a team.
Great, down here in the front.
Thanks, Patrick Tucker with Defense One. For Secretary Wilson, I have a question for both of you, but for Secretary Wilson, I have an understanding of what concept of operations for offensive cyber operations are. I have a concept of operations for defensive operations. What is a concept of operations for defending forward? What does that look like in real terms? And for Secretary Monfort, good to see you again. You've had now a long time of girding up the nation's defenses for interference in elections. Elections are next week. If there was one area that you consider to be the weak spot that's left, the area of improvement for next time, what would that be? So start with you.
So in defending forward, I think first is understanding the threat. And so day to day, like we do in all domains of operations, we try to understand the threat that may be emanating from a nation state or a non-state actor. And so we have a heightened awareness of what those threats look like. So defending forward, first we want to understand the threat, and then to begin to put in place options that are available if we choose to disrupt that threat, if it increases in risk and we're accepting an unattainable amount of risk, is to be able to bring options forward for the leadership of the nation to be able to act if we see those threats rising to a level that are untenable. So when we say defending for it, it's trying to disrupt or deny or degrade an attack that may be emanating from external to the United States, which is really inherent in everything we do as a Department of Defense. So when we say defend forward, it's really bringing the traditional structures of the department to bear in cyberspace.
Do I have to answer?
So cyber effects operations. So if we were to,
My
if we
question's
had to
harder.
develop, say we saw a threat, we saw a rogue actor, nation state out there that was beginning to formulate an option, and we could see imminent indicators, indications and warnings that there was an issue, and that there was, maybe through intelligence collection, we were able to discern that this is imminent threat. We would, as a Department of Defense, our job is to be prepared to disrupt or deny or degrade that capability before it has an effect on US, our allies and partners. So when we say defend forward, if we see that type of threat in the cyberspace domain, actors using the cyberspace domain to threaten or hold at risk the United States, our critical infrastructure, our way of life, that's the job of the Department of Defense, is to bring to bear the weight of the department in cyberspace, in this case, to be able to strike if required. The checks and balances now are in place. We have authorities that are in place with clear guidance as to how we bring those options together if needed, and then if we're directed to execute those options, to bring those in concert with the US government so we understand the risk associated with that in a coordinated manner. And it may be the last choice. A cyber effects operation may be the last choice. We might want to, there's the marshes, there's sanctions, there's attribution, indictments. I mean, there's a lot of run-up that may happen in this space, but we always want to have the option of a cyber effects operation in many cases for our really high threat situations. That's the job of the Department of Defense in this domain. And that's what we mean by defending for.
Elections. You know, what I've been, I would hesitate to sort of try to focus it in on one thing. What I think about a lot is looking back to 2016, where I really believe you know, everybody did the best that they could with the information that they had. But I look at as sort of, we had three main areas where there were places where we wanted to do better. And the first was visibility, having more visibility into state and local systems. And you know, we've had a unique program for years. Actually, we've been grant funding an organization, partially grant funding an organization called the Multi-State Information Sharing Analysis Center. They've really stepped up. They've created the election infrastructure, ISAC. And in just 2 years, we've gone from, this is a sector that, while we partnered with state and locals, it was typically the state and local CIO community, the more traditional partners, really had very limited interaction with the election side. We have gone from where we had sensors in every single state, and some of those may or may not have been covering election systems, to now where we have 90% of our election systems are covered by these sensors. And so that's 2 years. That's a phenomenal amount of change and ability. Now, that doesn't mean you can see everything, right? But what that does do is really increase, if I do get an indicator from one of my intelligence or DOD partners, I can push those against the sensors, and that can alert us and say, okay, maybe we've got something we need to investigate. It doesn't necessarily tell us that, you know, the Russians are coming. What it does tell you, though, is that you may have some malicious activity you need to be on the lookout for. And the other piece of that was sharing information with us. We have so much visibility. I mean, state and locals are sharing everything that is going on. And there's a lot of things that these are just IT systems, and IT systems do break. I think we all know that, but they're reporting a lot. They report ransomware if they've got it. May have nothing to do with you know, anything particular than a a criminal organization. But the amount of reporting that's coming into my organization is just phenomenal. I don't have a good metric yet in terms of the increase. But so that really just provides us so much more visibility into what's actually happening. And then the other piece, the sort of the second bucket that we've been focusing on is communications. If I do have intelligence that somebody is targeting an organization, we have long had a policy about we tell the target who may or may not be a victim, we don't know yet, but we tell the target and that's it. We're not in the business of running around telling everybody who's been a victim or compromised by an actor, and we hold that's a very sort of sacrosanct policy for us because it's all about trust. And but we did need to work through how do we ensure that the lead election official has the information if somebody is being targeted or is a victim in their state. How do we ensure that they have that? And so we work through that. We work through communications protocols. We know who's on point to receive information from us if we get it from the intelligence community. And the intelligence community is mobilized completely to really try to understand any threats that are possible to go under the election, to our election infrastructure. And then the last piece is really about crisis communications. Is how do we ensure that we're communicating to the public when and if something were to be happening, even if there's just somebody's claiming. How do we ensure that we're communicating consistently to the public and everybody has the same set of facts? So I want to continue, and we have addressed all of those, I think, very well. I want to continue to build on those in leading up to the 2020 elections. I think we're very well postured for next week, but there's always more that we can do. We've got over 1,100 jurisdictions that now participate in our information sharing collaboration program. We've got all 50 states that participate in some way, but of course there's always more that we can build off. And we'll continue, while we are very focused on the state and local election infrastructure, we're going to focus, and we have built some with the vendors and the private sector community. We've built the sort of structures to start talking with them. We are going to probably focus more in how do we work with and create all of these mechanisms on the information sharing and others that we've done for them with the private sector, and campaigns are always welcome to take advantage of our services.
Over here, third row, fourth row.
Thank you very much. My name is Serene Peter. I'm from the Russian embassy. Thanks a lot for a very nice presentation of the rise of cooperation, intergovernmental cooperation. But as far as we understand, all this cooperation requires resources. First of all, human resources and specialists in cyberspace or in cybersecurity. Last week, New America Foundation published a report saying that both government and private sector got serious gaps in human resources. Namely, if I'm not mistaken, they were saying that right now it's something like about 300,000 vacancies in this sphere, and the rise is going to be to the million vacancies in the nearest future. In this context, New America suggested to establish civil cybersecurity corps, which is going to be coordinated by DHS. It will include 25,000 civilians who, on a voluntary basis, are going to use their free time to help regional authorities in cybersecurity. So, in this regard, what is your evaluation on the human cyber resource gaps in the government? And do you think that the idea of New America is useful and can be fulfilled? Thanks a lot.
I could spend the rest of the time talking about workforce issues. I'll try to be really brief. It is a real challenge. I also think it's a real opportunity. Is the way I've talked about it a lot, is it's hard to know the actual gaps, the numbers. A lot of people use different sort of metrics to characterize what is a cybersecurity job. I've heard anything from 300,000 to 1.5 million, and so there's a lot of different numbers that people are using. There is a clear gap. I think it's the notion of cyber security as a discipline is still fairly new. It's sort of a mesh of a variety of different disciplines that have existed longer and we're coming together. And so we've worked for years now. If you're not familiar with the NIST, the NICE framework, National Initiative for Cyber Education, that kind of lays out here's sort of different elements of what it means to be a cybersecurity professional. We've worked with the Department of Labor to characterize that. The notion of having so that's all. I think we need to continue to do that, and the more that we can adopt that internationally, the better. Because we have a very mobile workforce, obviously, and so in terms of having a civil like a civil defense corps, we have talked about this a lot, and I do think we need something like this. The department actually, long time ago, was actually authorized to create something called NetGuard. Kind of a cheesy name, but it did sort of, it contemplated something along these lines. And so we're looking at different options around, where you've got, with the military, you have people after they leave active service, they sign up for, well, they don't sign up, they're told, they have to be in the reserves of the National Guard for a period of time. Is maybe something along those lines, where we have a scholarship for service program. Perhaps we create some sort of alumni type network where people agree, and I don't think I'd want to mandate it, but where people agree to say, you know what, I'll be available to be called up, and we would continue their training. These are all ideas. These are for all of you feverishly writing. These are all just sort of concepts that we're thinking about, but I do think there needs to be something there. I also think we can leverage our existing National Guard, and we're working through how we do that. But I've heard a lot of people come up with different ideas. DHS, I think we're the right place to sort of think about and build such a capacity. But we're still in the early stages of conceptualizing that.
And maybe just would add just a couple of quick thoughts. So in the Department of Defense, we have a couple of, three really flavors of our workforce. The first is, as Jeanette highlighted, is military. And I think that's what most people think about when they think about the Department of Defense. So our officers and enlisted members. What we see today is we don't have a recruiting problem. We have plenty of volunteers that have their hand up and want to come in and be involved in this mission set. So we have very focused programs on how to train them and grow and develop that talent in the military. Retention-wise in the military, we're doing pretty well. We have a couple of areas that we try to focus on, and we have incentives and those types of activities, just like we do in all other specialties across the military. As Jeanette highlighted, we do have a long tradition and an advantage in some ways of when people do leave active duty, either officer or enlisted, we have some options available for them. And so in many cases, if they're moving off of, they'll go on an inactive reserve status, but they also have a choice to be able to join the active reserve or the National Guard, Army and Air Force National Guard. And so in the spirit of having a kind of a civil service, but we do that for military purposes, national security purposes, we leverage the talent. All that talent goes out into the society at large and industry typically, and is put to bear for the nation. But we can also leverage that back into the military. And so there's been a long tradition of that. And then on the civilian side, we've established what we call the Cyber Acceptance Service so that we can be more agile and more flexible in how we hire and bring on board civilian talent, and then also set up pay scales, et cetera, and some flexibility in how we do that. And that's been the early indicators. It's just went into play a little over a year ago. And so the early indicators, that's been fairly successful. We're in the process, again, we started very small. We scaled once, and that seems to be going well. So the next step is to scale across the whole Department of Defense in 2019, later in the fall. And so we're learning the lessons, trying to wrap those in, but Congress was very, very helpful in terms of giving us the authorities to establish the civilian cyber acceptance service. So I think all the ingredients, I think we need to share best practices. I think one of the challenges as a nation, it's not just about recruiting each other's talent. I think we need to think of the problem at the national level about how do we grow the talent coming out of middle school and high school so that they're equipped. Students that are coming into the workforce are equipped, whether they want to go to a university or not. But how do we get them excited? And there's a couple of ingredients that typically work well is introduce them to the concepts, some training, a little bit of education on top, put them in with some mentors, and introduce them into some competitions and make it fun. And we see the programs that do that with those three ingredients are pretty successful. I would point to things as a former Air Force officer, like the Cyber Patriot program in Air Force Association and some others like that. I think there's some ingredients that generate a lot of interest from young people. And I think we need to grow that denominator of people that are interested in coming into the cybersecurity workforce, not just the military, but more broadly, and increase the denominator, if you will, of people that are introduced into the workforce.
So it pains me to leave so many hands in the air, but we're out of time. So I want to thank you both very much for coming, for sharing your time, for getting concrete with us on some of the examples, and sharing your last Cyber Month event
Sure.
with the group here. So please join me in a round of applause for our guests.
Thank you.